The purpose of this evening and the timing of this evening, this is our final evening in a series of events focusing on a healthy community. And this evening, we really wanted to be strategic prior to going into the summer. We are recording this panel discussion for the purposes to have it available for some of our families and parents who may find themselves in the summer really looking for partners. And if that be the case, we want to give them as many resources as we possibly can. Myself, Dr. Wexler, I know the many partners, Mr. Stewart, Mrs. Blake, we are all here through the summer, so we would be a resource. But I just want to make sure that the information is archived and available. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to our newly designated facilitator, Jennifer Blake.
Thank you. So as you know, tonight's conversation focuses on the school district and its relationship with community organizations. Specifically, our discussion will focus on how these organizations with us here tonight support our students and their families in terms of safety and well-being. We have 90 minutes scheduled for this conversation. If there's time at the end, we'll welcome questions from the audience. Otherwise, we will ask our panel members to provide contact information so that if you have follow-up questions, you can address them. Because we are recording the session for our community, if in fact there is time for questions at the end, we'll ask you to come to the podium and use the microphone. As we proceed, the panel will be asked questions and members will be invited to respond. Panel members, we ask that you answer each question thoroughly, that you press the speaker button on your microphone before you respond, and that while we ask you to be thorough, we also ask you to remain cognizant of time so that everyone has a chance to speak. So if we could begin by just asking each of our panel members, hi, Syra, to introduce themselves. It would be helpful to know a little bit about your organization, specifically how your services or resources currently support Great Valley School District students, families, and teachers. So,
and Ms. Blake, if you wouldn't mind, after the panel members introduce themselves, I would like just a brief moment to introduce our facilitators, if that is okay. Thank you so much. We'll start with the panel members.
I pushed the button, yes.
Absolutely.
I'm Ken Stewart. I'm the Director of Safety here at Great Valley School District. And our responsibilities in safety involve all of the emergency and crisis planning and response. That includes reducing risks. It looks at how we respond in the buildings and how we recover from an incident. And then a large part of what we end up doing, and we'll talk a little more about this in detail later, is working partnerships with many agencies at the local, state, and federal level who would respond in a crisis. So we have strong partnerships, we have interesting ways to keep them involved, and that's what we do.
I think I pushed the right button. My name's Giuliano. I'm here tonight as the president of the foundation at Great Valley. And the foundation is a nonprofit that seeks to uphold educational excellence in Great Valley, in the public schools in Great Valley, and to provide opportunities that inspire students. And we do that, hopefully you all know, through fundraising from the community, from individuals and corporations. And we use that money in two different ways. We currently the way we spend it is we look to district initiatives, things the school district themselves are doing, programs with the district, and then we also fund what we call venture grants, which is where teachers or staff, administrators come to us with ideas of something they want to try and do in their school or in their classroom. And we'll talk more about what types of venture grants we funded that have helped with this healthy community.
I'm Keith Walsh. I'm the executive director of the Great Valley Community Organization. I have 4 grown children that went through the school district system here, and I've been real big on volunteering in the district for a long, long time. Started as a school store volunteer. I ran the school store at 3 different elementary schools through all the years. I was on the board of Greater Chester Valley Soccer Association and ran their Pee Wee program for about 10 years. And moved on to coaching basketball at the high school level in the girls from 1998 to 2011. and was instrumental in starting the local youth basketball program back in 2001. And that became the genesis of our GVCO, or our Great Valley Community Organization. We became a 501c3 in 2005, and just offer programming to the community. We're here to serve the Great Valley community in a lot of different types of programming geared towards health, fitness, and wellness. And so we're plugging away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Porter. I'm the Executive Director of Be a Part of the Conversation. Many of you might have been hopefully at the vaping event we had back in April. Can you tell me if you were at that event? Awesome. That was a nice turnout, and I thought we were really happy with the response that we had from that event. Our organization is also a nonprofit, but what we do is community events that raise awareness about substance use, whether it's experimentation through addiction and supporting recovery. I am also a parent. I have 2 children, much older than high school age. They're in their 20s, almost 30s. And so one of them is a person in recovery, and so I've learned the hard lessons early on, and I'm happy to share my experience with anyone who might be, where I was back then. Thank you.
Hey guys, I'm Caroline Franco. I'm the Executive Director at Center for Families, which is located about 3.5 minutes away from here in Malvern. And we provide a therapeutic day program specifically for teenagers, as well as some parent programming. To answer the question, I think that probably the thing that we do the best at helping the Great Valley community has to do with these free peer parent support groups that we have that meet on Monday and Wednesday nights. We usually have anywhere between like 10 and 20 parents there, parents of kids that are struggling with mental health issues or substance use issues. And we offer those, to the community. We also have a couple other ancillary services such as yoga, art therapy, music therapy, mindfulness and meditation. And we have those both for teenagers as well as for parents. So our goal is to really try and pull in the parents and the teenagers together and get them to have an experience together and all that good stuff. That's it. Shoot, I almost forgot.
Hi, good evening. My name is Dr. Mitchell Green. I'm a clinical and sports psychologist with a private practice in the Haverford area. I see mostly student athletes from the junior level up through high school, all the way through college and beyond. And whilst athletes aren't really in some ways any different than the rest of us, they do tend to have some particular pressures as they try to get to the next level, or as they deal with competition or stress with coaches. And it's a very specialized kind of practice where athletes can come and talk about life on the court and life off the court. My practice is sort of divided into working on mental health issues that are going on with the student athletes. So you can be depressed, you can be anxious, you could have a diagnosable disorder and be an athlete, and sometimes they need some particular support, and then sometimes people come and see me specifically to raise their game and try to get to the next level. So I have a particular specialty in performance, and these kids these days feel like they're constantly performing in the classroom and on the court, and helping them sort through the pressures of that, the expectations that they're feeling, the worry, so my job is as much clinical as it is sport. And thank you for having me here this evening.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Joanna Wexler. I work for the Great Valley School District as the Director of Pupil Services. Our department assists with the supervision of special education programs, gifted programs, the health programs, counseling supports, mental health supports, and I think that pretty much covers all of it. I've been in this role for 4 years, but prior to coming to Great Valley, I was a school psychologist for a number of years, and a supervisor of clinical supports for a fairly large district. Have been part of school safety committees in a former district and trained in the PREPARE model, which is one of the nationally certified crisis response training programs for responding to crisis. So helped orchestrate crisis response in other districts, and now in this role as Director of Pupil Services, continue that work, and have worked very closely with Mr. Stewart in that regard. So thank you. Yep.
Thank you to our panel members for being here. And I would just like you to introduce you to Cyrus Allyani, is that how you say your last name? Who is a junior at our high school. Syra and another student facilitated our very first speaker series back in the beginning of the spring. Gideon is not able to join us tonight, so Syra and I are going to tag team this conversation, but we're happy to welcome you with us tonight. So we're going to go back and forth and we'll just dive right in. How's that sound? So as you know, this is the concluding event in our spring speaker series focused on creating healthy and safe school environments. To that end, we'll focus the conversation on both the physical safety of our schools as well as the mental health, emotional piece associated with creating safe school environments. So the first part of our conversation will focus on school safety and safety plans. If you were at the June 5th the first event in our speaker series, some of this will be familiar to you, but we think it's worth repeating. So specifically, we're going to learn about the community partnerships that exist as part of our safety plans. So Mr. Stewart, if you could begin by just talking with us about if the school district has a safety plan for each of its schools, and if so, how is that plan shared with staff?
Thank you, Jen. Yes, all schools in the Commonwealth are required to have safe schools plans. There are a number of ways that you can organize them, but in general, you must lay out what the hazards are that your school district might face. You have to lay out how you're going to respond to those hazards. And you have to have specific resources listed in there, and that's where the partnership side of this comes in. Who are you going to be working with in the community? What kind of connections are you going to make? And how are you going to involve them in your safety activities? Excuse me. Here at Great Valley, our plan runs about 300 pages. And I like to say that if you're having trouble sleeping at night, just start reading the preface. You won't get to the table of contents. You'll pretty much fall asleep because it's a lot of boilerplate. And part of that is because we have a lot of requirements that have to be met. And so everybody has to have certain wording in there. But the real core of this are the protocols that are developed out of this. Who is going to do what if we have an incident? And from that, we build our training, and then we also build our experiences. So here in Great Valley, we have a very impressive, I think, initial response guide. It's distributed to the entire staff. We do training through drills. We do training through exercises. This coming fall, we're going to be including a new net-based training program for our staff. But all of this is directed at building partnerships among the buildings because we have in each building a building response team that provides initial emotional and physical first aid. And they can be there in less than 1 minute. These are led primarily by our nurses when we look at the physical injuries that need to be addressed, and also by our school staff, particularly our psychologists and counselors, when it comes to the emotional support. We have terrific community partners, but we could be as much as 10 minutes away from a first arriving ambulance in the event of an incident. And so we have to begin helping people heal much more quickly than that. So as we go on here tonight, I'll tell you a little bit more about our partnerships, but it all builds from the plan. Each year we have to submit our plan to the state through the county, and I assume somebody reviews it. I don't know who would be able to read all those school plans, but I think what they're really doing is making sure the pieces are there and that you've gone through the process. So our safety partnerships begin with that planning process.
So you referenced the partnerships that exist among and between our schools. Could you talk a little bit about your role in creating partnerships with our local law enforcement and responder agencies and how that works to benefit our schools?
Well, when we look at partnerships, and I think the other folks on the panel tonight will discuss this in more detail, you need to look at some sort of common goal. What is it that the partners have that they can see they want to move toward, and they all have a piece of that movement toward it. And you also need to have a shared set of values. Now, one of the things that we have found is, and a lot of folks I think were surprised by this, but when we look at our emergency responders in the community, and that includes law enforcement, emergency medical services, fire agencies, emergency management departments. When you bring those folks together with our educators, and you go through a process of identifying the values that people bring to their job, it's amazing how much those values overlap. They overlap because these are service agencies. We're here to provide a service, and we're here to address issues. So when we bring everybody together, we have the opportunity to work together on shared experiences that allow us to apply those values. Here at Great Valley, we have multiple drills every year, and we're very strong on our intruder drills. We have the local law enforcement people involved in them. We have our office staff who actually talk the officers into the building and bring them to the place where the intruder is. Now, if you look at all of these incidents that we've had, particularly this year, the sooner you get somebody with a weapon on an intruder, the sooner the incident ends. And that's part of what we do here. All of our police agencies, for example, have key cards to get into our buildings. You have to have a level of trust with a partner to do that. But they trust that we will bring them in to the closest exit or entrance to the building, not in front of the shooter, but behind the shooter so they can take action. We practice that in every building several times a year, and we bring our staff together as our building response team responding to incidents, and then we bring everybody together in command exercises, actually right here in this room. Jen can tell you, as can Regina, that chaos would be probably the best word to describe those, except they're directed at giving us an opportunity to bring all of those responders, and we've had federal level, state, local, county people here, and we have a problem and we have to solve it, and we don't always agree. But in the process of disagreeing, we find out how we can improve our procedures. So we have here very strong emergency response partnerships, and it comes about by getting people together and compressing them and giving them an opportunity to work together. And I think you'll find that's the same with all of these partners. We're working together towards some common goals.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Before we move on from physical safety, Dr. Wexler, could you talk a little bit about how the district works with community organizations on things like student relocation in the event of an emergency or on postvention, that is the things that need to happen after the emergency?
So in terms of student relocation, I know we've talked as a district about when, depending on where the crisis occurs, what building will we use for parent and student relocation. And we've also had discussions about off-site options. So those are things that we look to formulate as a district so that we know what we have as resources both internally and externally. In terms of bringing in agencies to support students and families in a crisis, obviously, we look to use our own resources first, and typically what will happen in a crisis, whether it be a student crisis, death of a student, death of a teacher, et cetera, many districts will reach out to us, reach out to Dr. Speaker Polubinski and offer support, which is wonderful. I will say that when we're organizing support as an organization, I think there's often been a hesitancy to use outside groups because we know our own people and we feel really comfortable with our own people. And I think in the event of a crisis, many of our students and teachers, too, want to access the people that they know best. We did have the opportunity recently to use an outside resource because we were very overtaxed in responding to a student situation, a student death. So the IU, this Chester County IU, had reached out and said, please let us know if there's anything you need. We have basically a crisis response team for the county. And so we had firsthand experience. We were able to use that resource for the first time, and it was fantastic in the sense that the people that came in were very well trained in crisis response in terms of postvention, supporting students and teachers. It was really a seamless transition for them to come in and just sort of begin working with students who needed that support. So, and then they helped us with ongoing follow-up as well. So I think, you always learn from a crisis. We kind of stepped back and said, oh, we probably should have called them in earlier because the first day that we were responding, I think there was a lot of taxed emotions around that. But again, it's just sort of trying to assess in the first 24 hours, how much support do you really need? And sometimes you don't know until you are in it. But I think that having that opportunity to sort of, use the IU was actually sort of a silver lining in a crisis to know, okay, this is a group that we can really rely upon, and they have several people that they can deploy, which is really helpful. So I think right now, I would say the Chester County IU is our biggest partner, but we also know that we have the ability to draw upon other districts, or we've talked about using like Peter's Place if need be, or some other local, smaller community organizations.
Thank you. Perhaps the community often becomes most concerned about student safety in the aftermath of tragedies like the ones we've seen in Florida or Texas this year. Those events often lead to questions about whether the students demonstrated any signs of distress or feelings of isolation or anger. This leads us into the next category of questions that deal with emotional and mental well-being. Dr. Wexler, could you tell us a little bit about the personnel and services that exist in our schools to support students who may be struggling emotionally or socially?
Sure. So we tried to describe this to the community and our parents in terms of tiers of support. So obviously, many of you know school counselors are available, and they are there to support all students as sort of a first level intervention for students who may be presenting with some social and emotional need or behavioral concern. If it seems to be more significant than what a counselor can manage, because obviously they are often servicing several students, then we would go down to what we would call like a second tier intervention, which could include our school social worker or our mental health counselor who is contracted by the Chester County IU, and that person would come in and work with a student on a more individual basis. If a student is showing signs of crisis in terms of wanting to hurt themselves or someone else, we do have a risk assessment protocol that is put into place, typically conducted by our school social worker in tandem with a counselor or with a school psychologist. And then we help the student and the family access additional high-level supports outside school, essentially immediately, to make sure that if they are presenting with any type of concern, like I said, some type of threat to themselves or to another, we get them to be seen immediately for more treatment that would require very close supervision from a mental health perspective, which could include inpatient hospitalization. So we work through that. We as a school obviously don't have the capacity to demand that a student get that high level of care, but we can certainly do the beginning sort of interview work to assess what needs to happen next. Is this student comfortable going home with maybe a referral to the family to seek some counseling supports on a weekly basis, or is it really at a high level where we're saying, we really feel that your child needs to be seen like tonight, and we would prefer that before they return to school that they've had some type of assessment. So we work through that process with our families, and we use Valley Creek as a resource often, or the local emergency room, to conduct those assessments to determine if a student needs a higher level of care. So, but really, I think the day-to-day, most of the needs are managed through our school counselors, our school social workers. They're really the primary people on the ground supporting students on an ongoing basis in the schools.
One of the words often used around mental health is the term resiliency. How do our community partners work with students and their families to develop resiliency and strategies for healthy living?
Ms. Franco, would you like to begin?
Yes, I would. So when we look at resiliency, what we typically are talking about is this idea of risk factors and protective factors, right? And so when we look at risk factors, we're typically identifying things such as a family history of a mental illness or a family history of substance use, maybe some abuse that happened early on in childhood. We're oftentimes also looking at the risk factors of learning disabilities as well. So if a kid kind of comes into this world and is sort of dealt a hand that, that they're more at risk, oftentimes that can kind of decrease what we call resiliency, right? But what's really cool about resiliency is that it turns out that, like, if you imagine that those risk factors are like the holes inside of Swiss cheese, right? And that, you know, essentially the protective factors are the parts on the Swiss cheese that's cheese. Okay, roll with it, just trust me on this, it's all gonna come full circle. So, you know, essentially what we talk about is this idea that like every kid is made up of like 1,000 like slices of Swiss cheese, right? And that there's you know, sometimes there's a hole that might go all the way down, and that might be a really severe risk factor, but that typically their protective factors are actually covering up their risk factors. So you might have a kid who, let's say that there's a suicide in the family. That's a big risk factor for suicide. And so, you know, but let's say that they have a really, really amazing relationship with their mother. They find that their mother's really comforting. They find that they can go to them with any, like, you know, concerns that they might have about their friendships. They might come to them about, you know, going through puberty, whatever that might look like. That will actually kind of cover up the risk factor of the suicide in the family. Does that make sense? So, you know, essentially when we talk about resiliency, we talk about this idea of how can we get as many protective factors as possible. And the answer to that really comes down to communication, right, within the family. And we know that kind of one of the most effective protective factors is the family. So the stronger that we can get the family system together and the more cohesive that we can get them, which really comes down to increasing communication, making sure that everybody's kind of on the same page around boundaries, around curfew, around things like that, that we're really going to be able to build more resiliency within the family structure. And then, of course, when we look at schools and we talk about protective factors, we're talking exactly about what, you know, Dr. Wexler was talking about, which is this idea of increasing as much support and resources as possible to kids to try and increase those protective factors.
Dr. Green, would you like to add to that?
Well, when I think about resiliency, at least in the kind of work that I do, I think about asking for help, about the willingness and the ability for kids to ask for help being one of the things that will make them more resilient. But sometimes it's one of the hardest things for young people to do, to admit that there's something wrong, to admit that they can't figure it all out on their own. And one of the ways certainly to build resiliency is to be able to accept where you are and accept that you don't have everything sort of together and perfect, even though on the outside you try to give this impression of what they call effortless perfection. Perhaps you've heard those terms before, but on the inside, there's a lot going on, and being willing to talk about that and share that is one of the keys to resiliency. And the other thing I think of, which I know this district is working very hard to, and as are some other schools in the area, even at the college level in sports, is trying to be much more proactive and as institutions in building in programs like you guys are trying to do here, to get the conversation going about mental health issues being prevalent and okay, and that everyone struggles with something. In my job, I've been helped tremendously by pro athletes just in the last few months coming out, willingly coming out, not even having to come out and talking about their own mental health difficulties. And I you know, coming from me, it's one thing, but coming from someone they idolize on TV, it's been very powerful in terms of building a sense that it's okay to struggle and ask for help, and that's sort of how I interpret resiliency.
Mr. Walsh, I'm sure you see these issues too with GVCO and our student athletes that participate there and their programs. Can you speak to your organization's perspective and support of that?
Sure. From the get-go, when we started, for instance, when we started our basketball organization, we always felt it was important that we had a winner and a loser. And I don't, thinking back, that term resiliency probably didn't even come at the table at that point. But it's interesting because the whole point was to let kids realize, you know, we're trying to build a real sense of community with our programming and develop a lot of good relationships here in the community between the kids and the parents. And the whole idea of winning and losing gives an opportunity for the kids at a very young age. We do it all the way down to first grade. At a very young age, see that there is failure and you're going to be disappointed sometimes, and that it's okay. And that translates even further into the parents who wants to see their kids succeed. I mean, you've heard plenty of stories about parents on the sidelines and things like that. And we've seen that happen in the stands or on the sidelines of all these contests, where the parents start to get it too. Like, there's another day, there's another game, there's another contest, and it's not so bad that you're winning or losing. It's more important that really cliche-ish, but the kids are having fun. And in the long run, what we've seen over the last 17 or 18 years is that really has developed, that really has developed a real sense of community, and the kids really like just going out and playing with each other, regardless of winning or losing. It's still very competitive at all levels, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. And I guess that's how we feel like we've helped some of the kids and some of the families become pretty resilient here in the district.
Thank you. Also, for our community organizations, what services or supports do you provide for students or families who may be dealing with drug or alcohol abuse or addiction? And how can families access these resources?
And I'll just say just a quick word about parent resiliency, if you don't mind. I think that that's something that, obviously the panelists that spoke are talking about childhood resiliency, which is so crucial. But for the parent, I think what has always been the challenge for us is not letting fear get in the way when our child presents with a challenge. How do we not let that consume us with fear or anger or anxiety ourselves? And so, leading into what we offer as an organization to this community, and I'm really grateful that we have a partnership with Great Valley Community, with the school district, and working with Keith and other folks, that we are really, our aim is to empower family members to understand what resources are out there. And so, when we have different events like vaping, like talking about, how to talk to a really young child about substance use, how to talk to a young child about a family member who's addicted or alcoholic. There's a certain kind of language that you can use at different levels to help them understand behaviors, and being open to talking about difficult things with our children. When you have a child who's saying something like, I'm worried about grandma, and we're telling our child, don't worry about grandma. We're taking care of it. Well, they just told you that they're worried. Maybe we should talk about that and kind of foster that conversation. Or when a child comes home and you find out that they were caught smoking at school, are we going to have a big giant reaction to that, or are we going to respond in a thoughtful way and get on the same page with the other parent and that sort of thing? So what we try to offer is just an open dialogue to talk about some of these things that quite often we don't want to discuss even with our very best friends, because we see their lives going so beautifully, and why would I want to bring up something that might make them judge me or my child? We really believe that we're in a when we come together as a community organization doing presentations, we have support groups for parents, like some of the ones that Caroline mentioned at the Center for Families. This truly is a judgment-free zone, because everybody in that room has been there, and nobody's about to decide that you must not be a great parent because your child, has depression or has some kind of trauma, So it really is breaking down all those barriers like stigma and judgment and self-shame and all those sorts of things, so that we can get to, putting that oxygen mask on ourselves before our child. That's to me what resiliency looks like for a parent, but also just the connections to folks like the ones that are up here, but also other resources in the community, and there are loads of them, but it also just depends on the needs of the individual. And we're so fortunate that we have all these great resources, like the therapists that are nearby, that we can turn to for varying degrees of, need and that sort of thing.
Are there resources available to the school district or to our families to support efforts related to wellness and mental health? Ms. Giuliano, would you like to start?
Sure. As I mentioned in the beginning, the foundation is a funding organization. We don't come up with the ideas, we support them. And some of the things that we have supported in the past, I hope that your children have used or that you have come to. The foundation helped fund the Cara Bradley wellness mindfulness series that parents could attend, and also training for high school students. There was a weekly podcast. And there's also I want to read the exact description. There is a physical education elective at the high school, so those of you who don't have students at the high school. And this class is designed for students who are interested in developing mental and physical strength through mindfulness and yoga practices. The class will involve daily practices of movement and breathing and working together. Class activities involve controlled breathing, yoga, walking, and stretching in order to develop lifelong habits promoting wellness. And I was just thinking about yoga and sort of learning how to calm yourself down, and I was noticing someone needle pointing right before this started. And that to me, as a knitter, you have to find some way to sort of center yourself and have a moment, which is what a lot of these initiatives that we're helping funding do. Next year, we hope to help with efforts to bring this to the elementary school. And those of you with children in elementary school know they've actually started doing this a lot in the classrooms. In addition, we've funded grants, the fitness club at General Wayne, the challenge day at the high school, a technology safety presentation, which maybe some people went to. There was a speaker, really great speaker. The Olveus library carts, the pedometers at the elementary school that the kids have. And desk cycles at Charlestown. So all just to sort of get them moving and thinking about their bodies. So are resources available? Yes. The district, please come to us. Teachers, please come to us with your ideas, and we're happy to fund them. We hope to say yes to every great idea that comes, so.
Assuming that a healthy community is one that considers not only present issues, but also looks ahead at the future to plan and prepare, I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on the next set of questions from the perspective of your organization. So I'm not going to call you out, but if we could all sort of have a conversation about this. What issues, topics, or trends are you seeing emerge from students and families in our own community? And how do these align with trends we might see regionally or even nationwide?
I'll start. This is my favorite topic. So the thing that we're seeing probably the most at Center for Families is twofold. So the first one is that we are finding more and more, and this, I actually spoke to Agnes Irwin High School, and I've spoken to other high schools in the area that all have really echoed this, which is this idea that a lot of teenagers now, for whatever reason, we think probably we can attribute it to technology, but instead of kind of pulling your teenager back from going out and being like, don't go out, like, come back in for curfew, like, and your teenager's kind of wanting to go and like go to parties or do whatever, that a lot of times the parents that we're at least seeing, they're actually pushing their kids out of the door and saying like, get out of bed, like, go and hang out with your friends, like, get to school on time. Like, truancy issues have definitely been increasing with our population. My new saying is that like the new drug of choice is isolation, right? Like that they're really sick of interacting with their peers and they really just want to like lay in bed in their room, eat food, watch Netflix, and go on Snapchat. That's like their dream come true. Look, I get it, right? Because like that does sound kind of nice in a sense, like because I'm like a big Netflix person, so I like get them. But like it's a disassociation, right? Like, so when does it turn unhealthy, right? Like, so for me on a Saturday night, instead of going out to dinner, I might want to stay in and watch a movie. Okay, healthy, right? But I have kids who every single day, it's a struggle to get out of bed and go to school. When they don't go to school, they're in their bed watching Netflix and on Snapchat. When they go to school, they come home. It's now 2:30 and they're in bed from like 2:30 until the next morning. Like parents are trying to beg them to get up and go out, come to dinner. And that's like not necessarily happening. So it's interesting just because, now there's this app out there called House Party, where instead of like going to an in real life house party, like we used to, like keggers and stuff like that, they don't, they go onto their phones and it's like all of their friends on this app and they're just in their room by themselves on this House Party app. And so anyway, that's just like it's just really interesting just to kind of see the trend of kids going from like being very, very social to there being like a sudden shift in the social sphere from it being in real life to suddenly being on their phones. Like that's their social sphere. So when you take away their phones, that's why they freak out, is because of the fact that that's where their connection is. So that's just a big trend that we've been seeing.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that?
Please.
Do you see any distortion in their perception of like what reality really is, because they're living through social media or technology as opposed to real life experiences?
Yeah, so I think that that's the tricky question, right? So the tricky question is that there's all sorts of sort of like problems that adults see with this, right? And the reason why is because adults see a hierarchy of connection, right? So they go, okay, well, face-to-face connection is the best type of connection. That's the one that you want to strive for, right? And then they go, talking on the phone is probably the second best. You know, texting is probably the third best. Snapchat is probably like the worst form of communication, right? And so when we go there and we say like, okay, well, what are the implications for them being like in real life? Suddenly we're placing some like real judgment on their social sphere. And so I try and stay away from like any of those talks because it doesn't really matter. The train has left the station, right? So whether or not like it's really affecting them socially or cognitively, or whether or not it means that, you know, them isolating leads to depression and anxiety, which we know is true, but we don't tell them that because then they feel judged, right? But we know that when they're isolating, that oftentimes does lead to anxiety and depression. So that would be kind of the implication in a sense. But, you know, I think that when we look at just kind of saying to them, like, I get it, this is your social sphere. Let's talk about like some of the things that it really does for you, and let's talk about some of the things that you really struggle with it. That's kind of a good place to start, rather than like, well, you should be hanging out with your friends instead of sitting in your room at night. You know, like that's where things, I think, kind of framing the intervention is really important.
So with regard to trends, it is on. The nationally, certainly marijuana is a big concern just because there's this, a lot of surveys out there, but Monitoring the Future is a really good one that looks at perception and behaviors. So what they're seeing is while cigarette smoking has been dramatically declining in adolescents over a number of years, thanks to a lot of education and so forth that's going on to help young people understand the implications of the dangers of cigarette smoking, marijuana use, of course, is being legalized, whether it's medically or recreationally, various places throughout the country, and of course it's happening here. So the attitude is that this is safe, it might be helpful to me in some way, and of course they can find any number of websites that support that attitude. But what we know without a doubt is that, for a young person, and I love what a person mentioned to us recently, like, I don't care if you're pro or anti-marijuana for adults, how do you feel about kids? Because, are you anti-kid? That was what he said. Because really, we're talking about a developing brain, so if we're just talking about youth, which we are, absolutely no marijuana, not a good idea, not in any amount, not for any length of time, just because, that underdeveloped brain that's so vulnerable to being, becoming dependent on something when they're going through all this isolation, stressors, all that sort of thing. It's just not a good idea, and I could talk all day long about marijuana, but, really, we had this program about vaping, and I won't exhaust that because we had a program about it, but, people have this perception that it's harm reduction for cigarette smoking. That might be true for a 60-year-old chain smoker, but for, someone who's 15 and vaping, they were not a chain smoker. They're now being introduced to something, and there's all this research that shows that people don't even realize how much nicotine they're actually ingesting, even if it's just nicotine. Of course, there's also cannabis oil and other things that they're using the devices for. That is skyrocketing, and we do not know the long-term implications of this. And so really, that's the big trend that absolutely we're seeing locally too. Everybody wants to talk about this subject right now. I really applaud you for being one of the first out of the gate to really bring it to the community and talk about it. And I also just want to make a quick, serving minors is still an issue. It's been an issue since I was a kid and talked my parents into tapping a keg for my high school graduation party because nobody will come if you don't do that. What I know now is that is such a bad idea because obviously parents are then giving the message that, we condone this as long as you're with us, it's okay. Well, does anyone ever really believe that we're going to only drink alcohol in front of our parents? It's just not going to happen. All we're getting as a child is the message that it's okay with you if I drink. So to me, alcohol is still a huge, huge issue that I'm hearing from educators, that they're seeing with family members, and also with regard to the athletic events. Could you ever see somebody smoking a cigarette at a game? And parents would probably very overtly say, would you please put that cigarette out? And yet they have coolers with alcohol in them for the parents, and I'm hearing this a lot, and it's just disconcerting. I wish that as a community, we could move away from that and agree that we will not serve alcohol to minors. Really important. Thank you.
And it's illegal. It's illegal.
That too. So you just teed me up for my favorite line. And yet, as a family, this is the one law that we're going to break because it's that important that you have alcohol. That's, again, that message. So, thank you.
Dr. Green or Mr. Walsh, what trends or attitudes are we seeing in our student athletes that are either concerning or things that we're finding we maybe need to address that we didn't have to address at a certain level in the past?
Well, I would say perfectionism was the first thing that came to my mind. I'm often talking with athletes and their parents about kind of how they define success. And often there's just a very narrow band that at the end of the day they sort of see as what they're shooting for and they're aiming for. And it's in that attempt to try to just get into that narrow band that they define as success that has contributed to the anxiousness and the depression that I often will see in my office. So the amount of perfectionism, because the amount of pressure that kids feel, if I talk to coaches who've been coaching a long time, they'll tell me their kids are just different now. It's just a different world being a coach because the kids are expecting to themselves to get perfect grades and with the advent of social media, look perfect, live a perfect life, get into the perfect college. And so I would say that's probably the biggest trend that I'm seeing is perfectionism, and my work is trying to get them to redefine success in not such a slim margin and getting them to be able to make mistakes and able to be sort of see themselves as someone who's going to grow from the time that they might mess up or not get into the school, and those are opportunities for them to learn about themselves. So I say that's the biggest trend I'm seeing right now.
And I'll echo that, and I think it's traveling downward age-wise, and is what we see in our recreational programs. And again, not to bash parents, but that's where I consider the problem to be, because parents are putting a lot of pressure on their kids to win. This win at all costs kind of society, and that's we see that in a lot of the fourth and the fifth grade, tournament teams that are trying to go out and win, and I think a lot of it's driven by scholarships and colleges and try, like you said, trying to get into the best schools and things like that. And simply put, we try to stress the recreational part of this, and basically we just want the kids to go out and play and have fun. And we really go to lengths to try to make sure that our coach, the people that are coaching, the parents, they're all volunteer coaches, the parents fully understand that, and that the winning and losing is important, but not very much. So you take that additional pressure off some of these kids as they grow, because some of them do grow into decent athletes and will become a little bit more competitive later on. So I see the problem as drifting down age-wise, and that's a trend that I see.
As we focus on building a strong community, it is obvious that relationships play a key role. How do our schools stay current with the resources offered by community organizations?
So currently, I would say that in terms of community organizations, we do have a partnership with obviously the Center for Families and with Holcomb Behavioral Health. So Jacqueline Taylor is not able to be here tonight, but particularly at our high school level, our school staff who have more clinical background, like our social workers and such, maintain a very close relationship with those individuals. And then if students are then found to be in need of treatment outside of the school, oftentimes we'll have a release of records signed where we can exchange information and remain in contact with those that are working outside the school district and supporting students from an agency perspective. And then I just think internally, I know for myself personally, being part of the National Association of School Psychologists, when we have a crisis, we're often going to that national resource We are all professional members of that. There's a lot of training and resources involved that help us stay current. And then I usually, Mr. Stewart and Dr. Speaker Polovinsky and I will connect about our protocols in terms of postvention and making sure that it's still really up to speed with what the current literature is saying. So actually, we're in the process of looking at that right now, since our crisis response manuals in terms of the postvention piece had not been reviewed in some time, so we're doing that currently. And we're using some of those national organizations and the models that they espouse based on research to support that work. So I would say that for us, and here within the district, that's how we kind of stay abreast of what is current. So if you want to add.
One of the things that we found in the last 3 years is that there were protocols that some of our EMS providers were following that disturbed us in that we weren't able to get responders into the building as quickly as we would like them to be, because they also have to be concerned about the safety of responders, particularly if it appears to be an attack of some kind. Working with County Emergency Services, we found out later this year that they have been working on a program to address that very issue. So our connection down up through the county into our local EMS providers is giving us the updates on how they will be responding. And that allows us to train our staff to be prepared to do what we need to do to assist them get into the building. When you, excuse me, you may have read an article here last day or two that the paramedics were not permitted into the building in Parkland by some of the police officers, even though they wanted to go in. And we know that there are people in there who are injured. We need to get them first aid right away. So I think this is a significant change that we have going here in Chester County. It's probably, if it's here, it's a statewide initiative. We haven't talked about it yet. But that's how you use your partnerships to stay up to date. You share information, you present problems, and then you talk about the solutions.
How can students and families best learn about and access the resources available to them in the community?
That one's open to anyone.
Well, we work with Great Valley High School, specifically with Jane Trimble, and I think that probably one of the best things that they have in their guidance counseling center is just a resource table, honestly. Jane talks a lot about this idea that anytime that kind of a family comes in, she's able to hand out our postcards to free peer parent support groups that we have, and just kind of focused on this idea that getting them straight to the students and getting them straight into the hands of parents is, I think, really helpful. So that's something that I know that Great Valley has done.
And also, any family, I know that, I hope that folks here know that any parent who is struggling, that they can reach out to us. Our website is just conversation.zone, Z-O-N-E. We have a lot of resources on that website. So lots of information is there, lots of information about support group meetings, about therapeutic interventions, but also, let us know what you'd like us to be doing in the future, because we're going to be doing 3 programs here in the community next year, and would love to know, speak with me afterward and let me know what some of the topics are that you'd like to hear about, and we'll bring it to you as best we can. And we're in a lot of other communities in the surrounding area, so even if there's a topic in a nearby school district that you can come to, you can visit our website and see what's happening all over the place. People, cross-pollinate all the time and come to all these events whenever there's great information out there. We want to share it as much as we can. So yeah, our website is, I hope, a resource for everybody in this community.
One of the things that is happening at the NCAA level is they're starting to address the issues of athlete mental health, and it's really just beginning, unfortunately. But some of the programs, where I've been consulting to some programs, and they're beginning to try to put on their own website, the school's website, the college's website, and I think it's something that at the high school level eventually is going to be relevant, that kids can access, parents can access on the Great Valley website. Educational information, if in my area at least, about mental health and how to deal with stress, and where you can go and where you can get support, because kids are on their computers, parents are on their computers all the time. So I think I'd love to see not even my stuff, but stuff that could be educate the consumer to normalize whatever their experience is, and then hopefully point them in the right direction.
And finally, how can our schools, specifically our teachers, access funding for their ideas related to mental health and wellness?
I feel like anytime the question says funding, it's my turn. Hey, guys, it's me. So I'm here on behalf of the foundation. However, I have been on PTOs at the elementary and middle school level for a bazillion hundred years. And so I do want to suggest that the teachers also consider reaching out to PTOs. I know that the middle school for the past 3 years has sort of done like a mini grant, that if teachers have ideas for things, lots of things, they're not all related to wellness, that they've reached out to the PTO, and the PTO at the middle school has been able to fund many things. The foundation, again, we have a pot of money that's gone to district initiatives. And 1 year, and I can't remember the numbers, there was sort of a line item for mental health and wellness issues, which worked wonderfully because the district at sort of last minute notice had the opportunity to bring in, and I'm not going to remember his name, Chris Herron, the basketball player, and because we had sort of allocated some money towards this, the foundation was able to help pay to bring Chris Herron in, and by all accounts, a phenomenal talk to the students and the parents. Then in addition, the teachers, we have gone out and tried to make sure all the teachers know about the grant process and that there's a deadline, there's an application. Talk to your principals about your ideas, talk to the administration about your ideas, sort of work them through, and then fill out those grant applications. For those of you who don't know, we have a committee that's made up of a parent from every school, and they take this very seriously. One of them is in the room, and go through the grant applications and ask follow-up questions that you wouldn't believe, that we go out and get the answers to decide which grants should be funded. And that's a yearly process, and the deadlines are all on our website. I would also encourage our teachers, particularly at the high school level, to interact with the student clubs. The students know the issues that they're dealing with, and they know, like, you know, who knows what app is coming up next year, right? They know what needs to be dealt with, and they've done great presentations about a variety of topics to the students in assemblies. So I hope that everybody will work together for this healthy community.
Thank you. Given that we have about 30 minutes left in our planned time, we would welcome you, if you have questions for our panel, to come to the podium and ask those. You don't have to even tell us your name, just state your question. Anyone? Okay. Last call. Okay. Seeing none, I'm going to thank you, to our panel members, for your participation tonight in this important conversation. I hope that it was a great way for our community to learn a little bit about the partnerships that exist in the Great Valley community, and I encourage everyone to learn a little bit more about these organizations and the issues that we're dealing with together. So on behalf of the district, thank you, and I'm going to hand it over to the superintendent for closing remarks.
Prior to closing remarks, I just want to give any of our panelists, would any of you like to make any closing remarks before we end? Thank you for being here. Thanks for coming out. I want to say to the panelists, thank you. Not only for tonight, because this was a very small glimpse at all you do every day, hours a day, for us as a Great Valley system, but also for all of the folks in the community that you work with and help and rebuild and support proactively and reactively, and I really thank you for that. For all of you, thank you for taking time on June 5th to be with us. On a Tuesday night in June, I'm sure as you're sitting there, you have a zillion other things going through your mind on your to-do list, but the fact that you took time to come out and be with us tonight, thank you for that. Many of our teachers and staff that are here, thank you. I definitely know you have a lot to do, but the fact that you took time to support our students and each other as we travel this journey together, and we take very seriously the mental, physical, safety, health, and wellness of everyone within our community and our organization. And my hope is that as we continue on with these conversations, We will learn together, grow together, and get healthier together, and stay healthier together. So I really thank you for being here tonight. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or follow-up, I know Mrs. Blake will be sending out emails to those who are registered that to respond and provide us with feedback. As Kim had mentioned, we have the speaker series. We are scheduling that for next year. And it really is dependent upon the topics that folks within the community find to be of concern and interest. That is within our staff, as well as parents and students. So I'm sure Sarah will keep us current on the student vibe, and we will also find ways to access our staff and parent vibe as well. So I thank you for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. We have some extra time to spare.